A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to the First Impressions. So for this occasion on October 15th, I'd very much like to have another entry in this series. Sadly though, there unfortunately will not be anything relating to Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, even though I have hinted that that would be the next entry. Instead, I'm going to substitute it with an FPS title known as Starship Troopers Extermination. Yeah, we now officially have a game tie-in with Starship Troopers, based on the 1997 action-adventure sci-fi film, which was based on a novel. Yeah, I guess you could say that with each new generation, we're bound to get a new piece of media. Maybe we'll have something holographic, like in 20-something years from now. But even then, it's still a bit of a far cry from where Starship Troopers is set, in the 23rd century. Basically, a couple hundred years in the future from now. For the most part though, Starship Troopers Extermination is little more than just the sum of its parts. It has FPS, it has some action, it has some voice acting, it has some building elements, which itself might as well just be like Ark Survival Evolved. However, the building segment is little more than just having a certain tool on hand and basically building certain structures. Yeah, within only 2 hours, I can at least say there's not really much that it has to offer, unfortunately. And while it does do its best to basically capture the so-called militarism that is quite well known in the plot of Starship Troopers, where patriotism and authoritarian governance were quite profound within the storyline itself. In the film and in the book, they were both well expressed that at some point in time, with all this stuff about the military, with all these films, all these games, all these different things where recruitment as well as draftings would take place over time and oversaturate the future with little more than personal choice, it really gave us more of a reason to express ourselves that we don't need to prove ourselves in battle. We don't need to hold a gun. We don't need to show them what we're made of. We're more than comfortable, protected by the borderlines. We're more than comfortable with operating thousands of miles away from any possible battlefield. And even more so when you get to know the fact, supposedly, civil war could be at hand once again, just like how it was in the 1860s. In any case though, Starship Troopers Extermination does settle us off by playing as UCF members, right then and there on various planets. Planets that of course were set upon in the plotline of the film itself. And with these different planets come different missions. You have defending missions, which basically allows you to create caches, bunkers, and walled fortresses to protect you from the arachnids. Basically, giant bugs. And that was one unique thing about Starship Troopers though. Having to settle upon a certain war that had to do with bug extermination, that at the time was a pretty unique concept. But it was still not at all original. Especially when there were other films at the time like Mosquito or The Fly, or who could forget that horribly grotesque thing? Oh my gosh. And there was also Cell from Dragon Ball, whom technically was a bug man. So it's not a whole new concept when it comes to warfare on an intergalactic level or in a futuristic setting, but it really is a good question to implicate on, or at least dwindle on at this point, knowing that maybe bugs could become gigantic once again. After all, it had happened once before, hundreds of millions of years ago, in the Paleozoic era. There was once a time when temperatures were pretty warm, and oxygen levels were very high, causing bugs to grow to exponential sizes. That's how we have creatures like the Arthropleura and even giant bumblebees. But again, to avoid getting off track here, there's just not much more I could say. Yeah. Starship Troopers Extermination unfortunately is kind of more on the mediocre side when it comes to modern games. At least by FPS standards, it does pretty well, but on online multiplayer standards, not so great. In my experiences so far, there has been a numerous amount of lagging and buffering, most likely having to do with the fact that it's not exactly as professional grade in terms of connection. It's certainly not like what Activision or Treyarch had to offer over the years with all these new Call of Duty installments. They were sure able to do much better with maintaining stable connections to help prevent lagging, buffering, and etc. The occasional crash and host migration stuff still does happen today, but it's a lot more rare in comparison to some of the older titles that we got 10 years ago. So, while Starship Troopers has nowhere close to the multiplayer capabilities as well as server access as they do with Call of Duty, it honestly still does hold up in some degree. I still do have some entertainment made out of this, despite the problems at hand, and I still do have the enjoyability of it. The main novelty of it being an FPS game designed for you to be exterminating bugs, much like in the movie or the novel, depending on which way you look at it. And obviously this doesn't really intend on following the movie. There are in fact online missions that you can do, as well as offline ones. For the offline ones, or the campaign mode as Call of Duty has come to know about it, the case of Starship Troopers Extermination, though, is a bit different. It does, however, follow a very high-ranking member of the UCF. And much like how in the movie, this man doesn't mess around. He does assign you, the player, to be the leader of a certain covert team with a few other members. And when you complete all these different missions together, he'll see to it to give you quite the reward. Not just in the form of XP, but also in praise, which can be seen in large walls of dialogue with a giant picture of him. So, not exactly as elaborate as what Call of Duty or other FPS franchises would put together, but for something like this, given the budget and other things, it's excusable in some ways. Like I've said, I'm not all in favor of something like this, but for it being Starship Troopers, to have a video game adaptation of it after all these years, some people still do look on a lot of these other films with everlasting grace compared to how they were back then. They weren't exactly treated as events like other pieces of history, but then again, even some more obscure films out there happen to have video game tie-ins to some degree, like Surf Ninjas or Eddie Hawk. I mean, who would have thought? Anyways though, Starship Troopers Extermination, by my assessment, still does get a notable scoring for what it is. Probably no more than a 7.1 out of 10.1. Not exactly masterpiece level, somewhat mediocre by most tastes. Considering how many FPS games I've played, it's probably to be expected, the somewhat monotonous factor. But to be fair, Starship Troopers, as an FPS game, certainly does a lot better than I would have normally expected from other types of FPS games. It's certainly not the best way to put it, but for Starship Troopers fans, it certainly is right up your alley. And I might not have grown up with this film, or the book itself, but I could sure do tell, much like how Men in Black and other movies that had to do with warfare and bugs, it does pretty well in its own unique way. So, this does conclude another piece of First Impressions. Now I will come back on November 1st, hopefully with something bigger than just something that ends up getting sidelined. Maybe I could put in a pre-order for Call of Duty Black Ops 6. Maybe I could do it with other titles that are expected to come in the next coming weeks. Until then though, I will see you guys on November 1st with another piece of Mind.